Geoff, thanks a lot for being with us. You have this great experience of working in different conflict, aftermath of the conflict with refugees from Rwanda to Croatia, Yugoslavia, in Africa, elsewhere, and currently you are for 11 months in Ukraine. So can you please put the Ukrainian issue with internally displaced into the contents? How severe is the situation? How many people you would register? How big is the burden? And what are the biggest issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I think, first of all, in my experience anyway, the Ukrainian conflict in and around Donbas is unique because I see it as a very sort of politically motivated conflict, as opposed to others that I've seen elsewhere in the world, where somehow there was a type of logic to the conflict, and that logic, unfortunately, often resulted in hatred and between people. I don't see that in Ukraine. I haven't seen that going into Donbas and around Donbas. But the people are Ukrainians, and I've had the distinct impression of them being victims. They're all victims of the circumstances which has generated this conflict, and you know, the result of that, I think, is that there's a tremendous ability in the Ukrainian society to help people address the problems caused by these displacements, but that the humanitarian consequences are terrible, severe. And for instance, going along the conflict line to the villages that have been damaged by the fighting, you know, one is really struck by the fact that the populations that are left in these villages are generally old people. The young people, which is normal in most conflicts actually, young people find other solutions to their lives. They move their families out. They want to find schools. They want to maintain contact with services, and that's exactly what's happened here. And so the really severe victims of this are the poor old people who are left in villages that have been partially or in some cases quite badly damaged, and the conditions that are being created there are such that society will never be able to return those villages to the situation that they were in prior to the conflict, and that's a terrible thing. That's a generational problem that's being created now, particularly since I think it's also related to displacement in general, that young people, once they've found a way into the towns and the cities of any country, having been displaced, you know, they want to stay closer to where the services are. They want to stay closer to the bigger schools, where there are jobs, perhaps, where there's a little bit of money, rather than going back to the villages. So it's a long-term problem which has been created along the contact line and in the villages. It's also, I think, a long-term problem in terms of the economy. Already Ukraine was suffering from sort of long-term economic stagnation in certain places, and particularly in the east, perhaps. And I'm not so sure that I'm not an economist, so I don't know. But I don't think travelling around these the towns of eastern Ukraine, that I've seen that there had been much success in generating new economies to take over some of the older sort of Rust Belt type industries that there are there. So that also has sort of added to the problems of solving the issues for the populations. But then on top of that, of course, we now have a situation where there has been this upwelling of international assistance, but also national assistance through civil society, which has done a wonderful job, I think, in terms of the immediate reaction to the displacements. And we need to try to avoid longer term dependency growing out of that. So there are three three main issues there.
So let's summarize it. What are these three issues, just to be 1, 2, 3?
Well, I think the effects on the population, the old people, but the young as well. The fact that the localities where displacement has happened will not be returned to their pre-conflict state for many years, and the economic problems that are visible as a result of that, and then the issue of trying to regenerate the economy in such a way as to help the population not be dependent on handouts.
And if we speak currently about the amount of the internally displaced people so far, how many people, where are they mainly based? Because, you know, so what are the issues? What is the biggest condition? And also, besides the long-term things, what are their troubles? Is it accommodation? Is it the less of funding or unemployment, or what that would be?
Well,
so we're speaking about how many?
Yes, to answer that part of the question first, I think there's a lot. It's actually there's a lot of debate about how many people are actually displaced. And the government database says, gives a figure of about 1.7 million. But there is an ongoing debate within the UN about how that database, how those figures are arrived at. And it seems that that there are some issues over the process by which people deregister. So if people move, if they register, say if they go to Kharkiv, they register in an oblast, but then they decide to move somewhere else, there doesn't seem to be, as in my understanding of the situation, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism by which they can deregister in one place and re-register in another. So the database has become like a cumulative database, and I think there's a lot of work that I think the UN, but particularly UNHCR, with a degree of expertise it has in this type of thing, but with also OCHA, could do to work with the government to improve the quality of the data.
If we speak about the government and the laws, we recently, one of the huge issues is that because of there is no way, that isn't excused by the government, that there is no way to verify who is a IDP, who is not, to pay these the money. Then many people, because of the new legislation, can't get the money at all. So what are the issues? What is your concern, and what are the way out of this situation? What would be your also recommendation?
Yeah, well, our line on this, there are two things that need to be totally delinked from each other. One is the issue of pensions, and in our estimation, and I think according to Ukrainian constitution, a Ukrainian citizen who is entitled to a pension is entitled to a pension, full stop. Whether they are living in Donbas or in Poland, they're still entitled to a pension. And this latest move to revalidate, if you like, the displaced population seems to have affected the ability for people who live and survive on their pension to actually get it. And there we are very adamant that we need to find solutions with the government to overcome that. Now, so let me just finish your question, which was also related to IDP benefits, the benefits. Now, I think we all recognise that the database on which these benefits is the payment of these benefits is based is somewhat flawed, and the government has a legitimate right, of course, to revalidate the people that are recorded in this database. But we believe that it would actually there is a process towards achieving that revalidation, which starts, and I would like to think that it would start with a discussion, perhaps with the sort of expertise that the UN might have here, in how to achieve a revalidation of the IDP population and the payment of those benefits. And UNHCR does this in refugee camps all over the world, that it revalidates the population from time to time.
So, let me know, it's a very long discussion already, more than an ongoing discussion, more than a year. We're keeping on asking these questions from the government. they're separate, of course, the pension, the benefits, but really, what is international practice? Because what we often hear, that's impossible, though we sometimes know that there was a way, there was some recommendation from a different agents of the international community, how you can do that, because some things are done, for instance, in South Ossetia, in Abkhazia, you would have the policy, in Georgia, you have the policies that people can, for instance, go to the hospitals from one territory to another. There are different types of things. So what are the possible ways to, with the international community has the expertise and experience, which could be enforced to help the civilian population?
Yeah, I'm not really sure that I understand the question, actually. In terms
how you can really pay, what are the ways? What are really, if the government says it's impossible, we can't do that. It's impossible to pay the benefits because we don't know how to do that. It's impossible to pay the pensions for the people who are there. But what are the mechanisms which you can provide the people in this conflict on?
Well, it's true that that in the NGCAs, in Donbas, in the separated area, there is no banking system. So it's very difficult to see how the government would be able to pay pensions within that area. And for the same reason, the UN and UNHCR in particular, so far we have been unable to provide any cash assistance for the extremely vulnerable members of the population. But nothing's impossible, and there are ways of means of overcoming these problems. One solution, of course, is that the government has provided these logistics centres at the checkpoints. That's a very positive thing. If people can't have access to these services in the separated areas, then at least they can cross over into the logistics centres at the checkpoints. But of course, that means that you're sort of, by expanding that logistics centre idea too much, you're effectively creating the need for people to cross the contact line, to put themselves in danger every time they do that. And of course, crossing the contact line is not cheap, and it's not an easy thing to do. Ultimately, there has to be some return of a banking system in the NGCAs. I'm not sure. In the non-government controlled areas, in the separated areas. Yeah. So I'm not sure how that would happen or when it would happen, but I wouldn't say that it's impossible. It needs an agreement.
What are the chances that these kind of things could be misused? Because we, like coming from the previous conflicts, there is always the risk that some of the funding would be misused. But in overall, how it's considered, we understand, but in general we need to deliver to the bigger amount of people. So what is also, from your experience, what it
well, this is the reason why when where humanitarian assistance is concerned from the UN, it is often provided. I mean, first of all, there's always a need to ensure that if the UN is providing assistance, that the UN is able to monitor that assistance actually being given to the beneficiaries. Because, of course, I mean, and unfortunately, in other parts of the world, I've seen assistance being the possibility of it being used and ending up in markets and being put on sale, and then of course someone's benefiting from that from that money. So yeah, the UN will always try to insist on being present at distributions in order, and including cash, in order to ensure that the assistance is not being abused.
Yeah, we do understand that, and after some time there is this refugee fatigue in the society, and later you say that the people, and we've met that many people who kind of are, probably would be able to work or do the other job, but they're waiting for any kind of package or anything. So what is the simple tools really to do that? Offering a job, resettlement in a different way where the people, can find the job, because we understand if they're living in a village and, there is no job there, maybe then you by default creating the situation when people can't provide themselves.
Well, as an agency, I mean, we spend a lot of resources and time and effort in trying to monitor the situation of the populations, of the displaced population, in order that we can advocate with the international community, with donors, with the government about addressing the real needs. And it's very clear to us in our monitoring from last year and this year that you know, the primary concern of displaced people is a job. That's fairly obvious, isn't it? But of course, coming from that, the second thing that they will say they need, of course, is accommodation, which of course is linked to a job to an extent, is linked to the ability to earn money. But then the third thing, and this is particularly the case in the separated areas, is healthcare. And it's really, I've just been to a presentation this morning about a really very alarming state of healthcare in separated areas, but equally we've seen problems being reported by displaced people, and that probably is related also to the host community, the people that are still living where they are, about the lack of access to drugs and the lack of access to adequate healthcare.
How much money is needed?
Well, to do what?
To provide. I understand it will be very general.
To provide what?
To provide support for the, I know it's very maybe general question, but it could be simple, you know, to provide the internally displaced people or all the victims of the Ukrainian conflict, just at least for some time, you know, what is the urgency? Because Ban Ki-moon in the UN speech said, you know, we received not enough. Yeah. So what is enough?
Well, I would say it's the answer to that question, I think, is related to time and circumstances. What is enough? How much funding is required now? Now we're in a situation where we have a protracted conflict, where inward investment, particularly by the private sector, which is needed to generate jobs and then generate a flow of cash within the economy, is not possible because there is an ongoing conflict. And the first thing that anyone who's going to invest money in eastern Ukraine is looking for peace and stability. That's the first thing. So at the moment, the only intervention that can really be made sensibly is this humanitarian intervention, which is what we're trying to do. In other words, we're just trying to maintain a very basic level of assistance and standard of living. An
approximate 1 year budget for that, because if you know there would be people coming, let's say somebody from the
well, the humanitarian response plan, because and I'm speaking here because UNHCR is merely one agency of a number of agencies, including UNICEF and the World Food Programme, UNFPA, WHO, Health, etc., that is responding to this internal displacement. But the humanitarian response plan, I think I'm right in saying, is worth 314, isn't it, this year?
Around 300 million.
Yes, it's just over $300 million, which is being appealed by the UN agencies and the international community that are contributing to this response in the East. Now, that's just for the humanitarian response, you see. Now, let us suppose that peace broke out tomorrow and that it would be possible for inward investment to resume, then, and I've seen this, I saw this in Yugoslavia, I've seen this in places like South Sudan and elsewhere, where the international community, rather than an appeal as such, the international community and the big countries, the large donors, could be expected to create a multi-donor trust fund, which could be worth billions. It could be worth billions in order to try to stabilize and reinvigorate the economy. So you're talking two different scales of intervention. Humanitarian is very small, but only meant to sustain the basic minimum of life. And then when the ability of large-scale interventions becomes apparent again after the conflict, then it's a much larger money is possible.
Do they consider that the part of the solution is this Minsk agreement, which also part of it is holding the elections? Mm-hmm. This something which is currently politically discussed. Yes. And there is an issue with the voting right for
Yes.
internally displaced,
Yes.
and probably the refugees from there which went to Russia, somewhere else. So what are also your assessment and understanding of the situation, that, what could be done and what are the issues, what are the problems?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, our position on voting rights is very simply that displaced people should be able to vote in areas where they were displaced from, because otherwise, effectively, their ability to return to those areas would diminish. And certainly, one of the solutions to displacement is that people would eventually be facilitated to return to the areas where they came from. So that would be, as a basic human right. If you've grown up in a town all your life and you're then displaced, you should have the right to contribute to the future of that.
And how about also the elections on the government control area, because currently there is no this right?
Yes, there's not this right in the government-controlled areas, and this is also something that has drawn our attention. And we would want to also ensure, again, if people have the intention of staying in an area, then they should have the right to contribute to the political future of that area.
And we sometimes hear a lot of information about people returning back, because ceasefire is there. There are still, the OSCE would report on the sometimes fighting, but in generally we hear about more people going back to the non-government control area. What is your data on that?
I think there's quite a lot of anecdotal reporting on this. There is no database kept of the movement of the populations into the non-government controlled areas, and I really wouldn't want to comment on. I certainly have not seen with myself that what I see is large parts of the population having returned to those areas.
And what is the situation on the separation line? How you describe it currently? How easy it is for the people to move, and is it there?
I think things are becoming at the beginning of the year, things were quite difficult because there were several of the checkpoints that were closed because of again an increase in fighting and an increase in the shelling, etc. But just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, these places have become open again, and Zaitsevo I'm thinking of particularly, but also Marinka was also closed for about a week. These places have opened up again, and so that's a positive. That's a positive development for the population. There was a plan, or at least a move for some time now, to open up a checkpoint in Lugansk between the two parts of Lugansk at Zolta. But unfortunately, the latest that we've heard on this is that that's not been successful because of a problem of coordination with the de facto authorities in Lugansk.
In general, how difficult is it to commute between or how easy it's
Well, it's not the sort of thing, it's possible, but there are long queues for people trying to come into the government-controlled areas. The de facto authorities recently set up some customs-type activities at these checkpoints. There's a lot of things that would dissuade anyone from crossing the contact line unless it's absolutely necessary. And what's interesting is that we continue to see large numbers of people moving backwards and forwards over the contact line, and I think that's an indication of the need that these people have to come into the government-controlled areas of the East for access to services and to goods.
From your international experience, this kind of a separation line, how usually they're handled, and what is probably the best way for long-term perspective? Because some people would say, from the security side, you should close it. Somebody else would say it's better to make the people to cross it easily. The separation line's always more harmful in the long term. So what is I understand it depends from the conflict to conflict, but still.
you know, the checkpoints. I think there's many different ways of looking at it. Obviously, if one is dealing with the pure security aspects of what's happening there, then there would be an argument to close everything and for no one to be able to move. But from our perspective, and I think most people's, from a humanitarian point of view, and particularly if you have your family on the other side, or family members, or your property, or you're displaced from there, then of course the advantage is to try to maintain as many of these crossing lines and these checkpoints open and functional, and to facilitate the movement of people who, again, as I said at the beginning, you know, who are they were just pure victims of the fact that they happen to live in one town or another, as to whether they're on a government-controlled side or a non-government controlled side.
How can you describe and what is known about the situation of internally displaced people inside the not government-controlled area? Because there are people, for instance, from the village who could, the village is destroyed, they go to Donetsk, or the village is destroyed, they are in Lugansk.
They go to Lugansk, yes.
They are still displaced people.
Yeah, they are displaced people, but much smaller numbers than on the government-controlled side, and we have intervened with some of these places. Most of these displaced people on the in the non-government areas are living in collective centres. They are housed in collective centres, and we have provided, and I think other agencies have provided assistance over the.
What is the current situation with UNHCR working on the Donetsk, Lugansk, and that areas? What you can do, what can you provide, what are the obstacles, what is possible, and what is done?
Well, I mean, since last July, there's been an ongoing discussion with the de facto authorities about accreditation, and not just for UNHCR, but the whole. And in Lugansk, back in October, actually, we were given authority to begin operating again. So that was a very positive thing. And more recently in Donetsk, we were given permission to carry out some winterization distribution, so coal and clothing essentially. But we were very happy that we were, although the authority to do that was given very late, it was actually the end of December, we were relieved that we were able to contribute that, because it was a pretty big, it was a large program, and we think you know, it did have an impact on helping the most vulnerable parts of the population get through winter.
So, and how it's currently? Can you provide?
Well, yes, and in fact, I mean, currently we're working with some national, small national NGOs, and we have an international partner in Donetsk called PIN, the People in Need. It's a Czech NGO. In Lugansk, we are looking for ways of continuing our shelter program. So we already have been implementing a shelter program in Lugansk since last October, and something in the order of, I think it's over 200 truckloads of roofing materials has been so far sent into Lugansk. So we are having an impact in Lugansk for the very vulnerable people living in the areas that have been most damaged, you know, going back to 2014.
What the Ukrainians should also know about the Ukrainian citizens which had moved to Russia and Belarus. How many of them have they moved? You know, what is also the information about them?
Well, I'm afraid that we don't really have very much access to the Ukrainians living in the Russian Federation. The last
how much people we speaking?
Well, it's about 800,000 was the figure the last figure that I remember, as having sort of moved out of Ukraine into Belarus and the Russian Federation. I think that where returns to Donbas are concerned, probably if there are returns, they are coming from that population that moved to Russia. But I don't really have very much. I don't have any data to quote. That's anecdotal rather than anything based on data.
So if to summarize, look, imagine a situation when you have a chance, you know, we have a chance to talk to the leadership of the country, you have a chance to talk to your leadership. So what are like 1, 2, 3 things to be done at this point? Something that probably not so mentioned in the press and not covered enough. Besides that, more help is needed, you know, more support is needed.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? The three things that, well, you know, firstly, I think we're all human beings, and we all have some area where we can communicate, and I would say that someone in Ukraine and someone in Donetsk or Lugansk can find a way of communicating. That's the first thing I would want to see, is communication being opened up, instead of what I see is perhaps doctrinal positioning. Yeah? And because at the end of it, it's human beings that are suffering here, and so it's that communication which is essential, which would lead to a proper dialogue and a solution to the issue, whatever that solution might be, to prevent further damage being done to the society and to the people. But in terms of what needs to be done, what the UN agencies can continue to do and contribute with the government, I would hope, and Ukrainian civil society, it is you know, to continue building this civil society that you have. You have a really remarkable civil society, the national NGOs. That is going to, I think, personally, I think it could form the bedrock of an interesting sort of social support after this conflict is over.
Is it a common practice to have something like that?
No, it's not. This is why I say it's remarkable. It's unique in my experience. I've seen nascent civil society in other countries, but not the sort of appreciation of how to be organized. First of all, people became very organized very quickly, and with the right level of support and encouragement and training, I think you have something here which in the post-conflict, you know, the post-Soviet world that Ukraine is now entering, and hopefully post-conflict, you have really a sort of a gem to help support the most needy parts of your society. And so this is an area that we, UNHCR, really tried to support very much last year, and I hope we'll be able to do so again, you know, during the course of this year. Then there was a third one, which I would think is preparation for economic revival. And that means sort of early recovery activities, helping to train and educate the population for the new economic realities that they have to face. But I think they're perfectly capable of understanding that they have to do that very well educated population. And yeah.
And my final would be about something, you know, today, refugee crisis, which is really highlighted by this press in Europe, is often used for the political debate. A lot of people say that incredible what's happening, but we know what's happening in Syria. Yet, from your experience, how you also assess that, and you know, what probably we should also rethink about the idea of the refugees, because we still feel that there is a solidarity, but there is a kind of a lack of solidarity in different countries compared to what is happening. And you know, there is all this debate: who is an immigrant, who is a refugee, who has to apply, who not. So with finally the refugee to being number one in a political agenda in Europe, what we should probably reconsider, and what could be also the solutions for what we have regarding the Syrian crisis, regarding all this use of the anti-immigration rhetoric by the populists, which all the political leaders are very much concerned.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, the first thing is, of course, that the solution to the Syrian refugee problem in Europe is a solution to the Syrian problem, is a solution to the Syrian conflict. Again, it comes back to the solution to the conflict, and that is a very high-level political process which needs to be engaged by very high-level politicians. But they're not doing it, I would say. From my personal point of view, I can see that around the world, these people are not engaging in their responsibilities. But as far as the humanitarian aspects of the conflict, of the the influx of refugees into Western Europe is concerned, I would say that it is not helpful to use it as a political football and to generate political rhetoric which might be anti-migrant, anti-refugee, call it what you will. It will not help the situation. It will just inflame the situation. What we need to emphasize here is the need for tolerance and the need for the acceptance that these people are fleeing conflict, and then look for longer-term solutions to their problems in their own countries.
But how come we are so unprepared? If you look, for instance, to the previous conflicts, you know, there are so many refugees and IDPs in Africa, in Colombia, in Middle East, you know, and all of a sudden these figures are big for Europe, but they're kind of, it's possible. And now we sometimes hear ridiculous numbers of 500 people the country can accept, or like 2,000 people the country can accept. So what's generally going on?
Yes.
For somebody who worked for decades with this issue.
Well, for someone that's worked in refugee camps in Kenya, for instance, where there are now 500,000 Somalis just in one part of northeastern Kenya, you know, I find it a little incongruous on the part of European countries that they expect many other countries to absorb large-scale refugee problems, but then of course they're unable to do so themselves because they're now realizing the social consequences of that, and yet other countries have been expected to do so over many years.
The question which is also bothering us a lot, it's the difference between the refugee and the economic
The migrant, yes.
But really the debate of these days, that there are often people coming from, let's say, Libya or from Libya or like Pakistan,
yes.
Afghanistan. They definitely going to search for a better life and a job. So are we at this but there is this clear separation. Are we rethinking the concept of a refugee? If I'm very poor and I want to go to somewhere, isn't that I'm also living, you know, I have to leave the place where I can be, you know, live in a decent life?
Well, that's a
complicated issue.
I have to say that's an absolutely excellent question, and but I think it's one that you should be asking someone in Geneva to answer.
But are you discussing these questions today?
If you're not going to record this anymore, then I'll give you the answer to that. Personally, I think you're absolutely correct that there needs to be a review of the convention. The convention was written in 1951 to accommodate the post-Second World War caseload. We're in a different world now. Well, this is a completely different world with different problems and different solutions to those problems. But you know, there's a certain reluctance to put the convention back on the table to be rediscussed internationally.
We have a debate when, you know, you have used these words refugee and migrant as synonyms,
right.
but that's not true.
No. Well, in fact, you know,
if somebody's going from Libya within the boat to Lampedusa.
Yeah. No, it's a. But
it's always a particular story, but in general.
Well, you know, I mean, a refugee is a refugee. But first of all, a refugee is recognised as a refugee by the national government of the country in which that person is claiming asylum. So the person comes to Ukraine, it's the government of Ukraine that recognises the person as a refugee after interviewing. And we, UNHCR, have this process called refugee status determination, which involves a one-on-one interview. What's your problem? Where did you come from? Why did you come? Oh yes, you're a refugee, or no, we're sorry, we don't think that you're a refugee, you're a migrant. But in the situation that you now have in Western Europe, where you have this large-scale influx, it's impossible to sit everyone down and say, well, which village did you come from, and why did you flee, and what actually happened, and then to check it out. There's this sort of acceptance that, well, we'll just call everybody a refugee. Now that, in my opinion, undermines then the whole international legal status, if you like, of what refugees are.
One small issue to figure out also, just to probably clarify, how about the Ukrainians who going to seek a refugee in the Western Europe because of this, because of the Ukrainian conflict? Because there would be some things people thinking like, oh, Ukraine in the conflict, in the conflict zone, so there would be Ukrainian refugees coming to, I don't know, Western countries, to Germany, to elsewhere, the Netherlands. How it's in general, because from what we feel, the most of them are still staying close to
they're
the
staying
conflict zone.
in Ukraine, and they're staying around which means that you know, I haven't read or seen anything to suggest that there are Ukrainians going further west into Western Europe claiming refugee status. You know, to qualify for refugee status in outside Ukraine, they would have to prove that first of all they are being persecuted in some way, well, in the whole country, that they can't stay anywhere in Ukraine.